Story 1. Someone in the next office was on the phone to a colleague in the World Trade Center, and I heard him say, "He's hung up on me." I had just seen the news about the first plane. I didn't know what to say to him. Then we went to a nearby bar to watch the news in the city of London. At one point, the news reported that there was a plane coming into London with whom they couldn't make contact. The 3 or 4 minutes of uncertainty about whether to stay where I was, near potential targets, or go to the train station were possibly the weirdest of my life. It was a total dislocation from normality while watching the horror on the TV. Story 2. The firefighters wore devices that would beep if they did not sense any movement for a set period of time. There was a clip of an emergency worker walking through the rubble, and you could hear what sounded like dozens of those devices beeping. That has stuck with me more than anything else from that day. Story 3. Hearing my teacher's involuntary, guttural scream of grief and fear is something you never want to hear. It represented everything you didn't even know existed as a 6-year-old. Her son worked there and he didn't make it. He was pretty young, probably in his 20s, maybe younger than I am now. We didn't see her for a few months after that. I think she came back in the spring. I think about her a lot, but as a 6-year-old tends to do with their teacher, I lost contact long ago. If she's still around, I hope she's doing okay. But I'll never forget the sound she made that morning upon finding out what happened. It's as if she knew. I've never been completely sure since I didn't know his name, but I think he was on the floors of Cantor Fitzgerald that were a total loss. So I guess she probably did know once she found out what floors were hit. Story 4. The second tower was hit, leading to the sudden realization that it was a deliberate attack. It was frightening to watch. Story 5. Waiting in line at Bellevue Hospital on the east side of New York City to give blood or volunteer, I observed the ghostly parade of people who made it out, covered in dust and ash, walking up from downtown. I was finally turned away because they weren't finding enough survivors to need our help. Story 6. It will always be the jumpers. The women holding their dresses down as they leaped to their deaths. People holding hands as they jumped, terrified firefighters watching. This one also stuck in my mind. Kevin Cosgrove trapped above the fire in one of the towers, on the phone with emergency medical services. Warning: not suitable for life. Story 7. I was waiting for the phone call to find out if my uncle was still alive, as he usually was at the Pentagon by that time. However, that day, for the first time in 20 years, he left the house late and got stuck in traffic. Story 8. I was a senior in high school at the time, and my dad was in the National Guard. I left school, and as I walked into the front door of our house, I saw my dad in his battle dress uniform with his bags packed, ready to go. He was sitting on the couch watching the news, waiting for the call. I asked him, "What's going to happen?" He replied, "I don't know." The look of fear in his eyes is something I'll never forget. Moments later, the house phone rang. "Yes, sir. Yes, sir. On my way, sir." "Thank you," he said as he hung up the phone. Then he turned to me and said, "I have to go, honey. This moment will stay with me forever." I was terrified that I might never see him again. You could tell he was concerned not only for his fate, but also for his family and for the country. Story 9. September 11th was the worst day of my life. I was 15 at the time, and my older brothers were 19 and 22, both serving in the military. I remember watching my mom cry as she watched the news because she knew what it meant, that my brothers would be deployed. I still remember walking into the living room, the TV on, my mom crying, and my dad sitting at the table watching it. For months later, my oldest brother was killed in action. 7 months later, my other brother was killed during deployment. My mother was absolutely devastated. We grew up in a very close family, including extended family. My mother committed suicide 3 months later. Within a year of September 11th, I lost my brothers and my mother. My dad barely held on to things and managed to keep us afloat, being there for me and helping me graduate. When I turned 20, my dad died of an overdose. I know it was intentional. He had become a shell of a person. He and my mother were high school sweethearts and had only been with each other. He served and retired from the military and was a significant reason my brothers enlisted. To some degree, I think he felt guilt. I never blamed him for leaving like he did. I don't know if I could have lasted as long as he did in that situation. Within 5 years of September 11th, I lost my whole family. Years of therapy and being in a healthy relationship have helped, but there are still days when I am unable to get out of bed because of the depression. But I take it one day at a time. Thank you all for the kind words and virtual hugs. For those asking, I still have extended family. I had an uncle who stepped in after my dad passed away and became a father figure. He always checked in on me, made sure I had food, supported me in college, was a groomsman at my wedding, and was there for other important life events. I am extremely thankful for him. And for the record, yes, my dad was former military, but he was very kind. I had lots of friends with military dads who were tough and cold to say the least, but my dad was an extremely warm and happy person. He believed in working hard for your name, but also being kind, and he was always there for us growing up. Story 10. Knowing something has changed for the worse in our world. The 1990s were full of hope and excitement for the future, but it seems to have become sad after that tragic day. Story 11. Definitely realizing the small dots were people jumping because that was preferable to what was happening to them. It still affects me, and I was in high school. There was also the concern that more attacks could occur throughout the day. Once there had been 2, and then they kept happening. You didn't know what else might be unfolding. And really, nobody did. Imagine you're in a classroom, and your teacher, your supposed responsible adult, is trying to provide some normalcy and reassurance. Yet they don't know what's going on either. Afterward, I think it was watching the hatred grow. Story 12. I was 26 years old and watching it on television in the office in upstate New York since our internet was basically unusable due to all the traffic. The news network wouldn't even load, so I had to watch after hearing about the first plane. There were 3 distinct moments when I clearly remember who was standing next to me and in front of me when it happened. 1. Second tower hit. This is intentional. 2. Pentagon hit. Our whole country is under attack. 3. First tower collapse. Many people just died. A few days later, there was a 4th moment when someone published pictures of a park and ride lot at the Meadowlands filled with all the cars that had been parked there and hadn't moved since Tuesday morning. I thought of all the people who were killed and their loved ones and everything they must be going through. On top of it, they needed to figure out how to retrieve their family member's car. I wasn't sure where my mother even keeps her spare key. How do you deal with that? I'm not sure why that hit me as hard as it did. Story 13. Those who are alive and old enough to remember September 11th. Well, that certainly made me feel old. Story 14. The tier probably goes like this. 1. The absolute worst was the jumpers. Very close behind was the first of the 2 tower collapses and then the second. Up to that point, most people were still able to rationalize in their minds, even if they knew it wasn't true, that there might be some hope of reaching the people above the plane impact level. Not only did you have the realization of how many people just died, but also that a huge chunk of New York City's fire and rescue, police, and paramedics were just wiped out. The moment the second plane hit, everyone knew it was terrorism. The moment the Pentagon was hit, it was like all bets were off and everything might be under attack. There were so many rumors of other targets that day, like an explosion outside the State Department, or people running from the White House, even threats on other major cities like Chicago and Los Angeles. That's when the nationwide panic really hit. Story 15. I was just a kid when it happened. All the teachers were panicking and running to other rooms, whispering. Once my class turned on the television, a few minutes of stunned silence later, we saw another plane hit the towers. We watched it for a little while before the principal decided it was best for elementary school students not to see that. So we turned it off and returned to our lessons. The rest of the day, I kept imagining a plane slamming into our school building. Even living several states away in a small town, I didn't understand the scope of what was happening, and the adults decided to stop answering any questions or discussing it at all after we had seen it. Story 16. Everything. Watching in horror at the aftermath of the first plane, only to see another plane come into view and cut right through the second tower. The sound of pure terror in the voices of normally stoic newscasters. The realization that we aren't as safe as we thought. Those poor people making the horrific decision to jump instead of burning alive. The first tower falling, and you start calculating how many people were in the building, only to have the second one fall and double your calculations. The ash cloud enveloping everything. The sounds of panic, fear, and despair in the voices of people running for their lives or being interviewed on television. The weeks of the body count rising. All of it was just absolutely horrible and will stick with us all until we die. When people ask what's wrong with my generation, this is a big part of it. Mass post-traumatic stress disorder that has never been properly dealt with, followed by 20 years of war, the rise of social media and its negative effects on our mentality, and then topped off with a once-in-a-four-generation pandemic. We are a troubled generation because of all of this, and September 11th is the first and biggest part of that cacophony of chaos that defined the early millennial formative years. Story 17. Seeing the images of people in the windows, waving for help, and knowing they weren't saved. Story 18. Having family members living and working nearby and not being able to communicate due to collapsed phone lines and cell phone issues prevented any calls from going through. Story 19. I was in college at the time and remember the confusion of what was happening, the fear that we didn't know if more was to come that day and where it would be, watching people jump live. Fast forward to 2024, watching my father die in the intensive care unit after a double lung transplant. He was a firefighter on September 11th and helped with some recovery efforts after the towers fell. After the towers fell, the radios played music montages, often including My Heart Will Go On. And during these montages, they played the phone calls of people trapped in the buildings or calling from the planes on the street and so on. That continued for months. During that time, for the first time in my life, America felt truly united. Shortly after, in 2002, the news had a countdown clock to the second when President Bush declared war. It was actually when Congress passed the authorization to use military force against Afghanistan. So we went from one crisis to another. Story 20. Seeing the trapped people actively choosing to jump, knowing they would not survive before the buildings collapsed. Story 21. I woke up and came out into the living room, asking my roommate what movie they were watching, not realizing it was the news. Story 22. Second tower being hit. That was the moment we all knew it was deliberate. I walked into class between the first and second blocks, crossed the plane of the doorway into history, turned my head toward the television that was already on, and saw the second plane hit live. At first, I thought it was a replay but immediately realized it was a commercial airliner, not a small aircraft as the principal had previously announced on the intercom while waiting for the first period to end. That moment, everything changed. Story 23. I would prefer to respond positively. It was inspiring to see New Yorkers, often perceived as rude and standoffish, come together and help others in the way they did. The firefighters and police officers truly honored their profession in ways that we seldom see today. Story 24. The moment I saw the intensity of the fires, I knew that both towers were going to collapse. I was in architecture school at the time. We had just completed numerous seminars on the structural engineering of high-rises. I realized that what was happening was the worst-case scenario because it was essentially unforeseen. When high-rise steel frame buildings catch fire, there is time to evacuate them because the structural steel is encased in concrete. The concrete acts as an insulator, preventing the steel from deforming due to the heat of the fire. Even an ordinary office fire, fueled by burning furniture, fixtures, paper, and carpet, quickly reaches around 400 degrees Celsius, which is more than enough for construction steel to expand beyond its tolerances. However, safely encased within concrete, it takes hours for the heat of the fire to reach the steel. The structural beams do not deform, and the structure remains viable, allowing for evacuation. But I just knew. The aircraft had plowed into the tower at high speed. They had gone straight through the thin outer curtain wall, which was not load-bearing, without any loss of momentum and continued deep into the center of each building. They penetrated the middle of each floor plan, where the structural columns, stairwells, and elevator shafts were situated. Those structural columns had been hit by the mass of the aircraft and unchecked momentum. They essentially took the full impact directly. The concrete was instantly pulverized, and the structural steel was exposed, directly to a jet fuel fire burning out of control over at least 5 floors in both towers. The steel expanded and deformed, The structural geometry was compromised. That floor collapsed directly onto the one below, which now had the entire weight of the building above it to support, causing that floor to collapse directly onto the one beneath it. Cascading collapse. Jet fuel does not melt through steel beams. It does not have to. The fire only has to make the beams buckle, and it does not need to be by much at all. Essentially, there is no structure anymore. I watched, knowing they were sending first responders into towers that were already lost and that everyone trapped in floors above the fires was lost. You can argue that we really should not build much above 10 floors. High-rise fires are extremely hard to manage, even when only foreseeable disasters occur. To date, there is no fire department in the world that has a viable plan for safely evaluating a similar building if this ever happens again. Never take a job that requires you to work in a skyscraper. Story 25. Not knowing if there would be more attacks, the sense of fear that arose was likely worse than the attacks themselves. Most Americans believed they were untouchable due to the protection of the oceans and a strong military. The events of September 11th changed that perception of invincibility in our collective consciousness. Story 26. Seeing the second plane hit the tower live, everyone on the news was saying it must be a terrible accident until that moment occurred. Story 27. Watching the news with my family after school, I saw images of death and destruction. A news anchor remarked that someone, somewhere is watching this with a smile on their face. Story 28. I was in 5th grade in art class when another teacher burst into the room to tell our art teacher to turn on the television. I remember we all started gathering several classes into classrooms that had televisions since not all of them did. When the first tower collapsed, one of the teachers began to have a hysterical breakdown, and other teachers had to usher her out of the room to calm her down. She was audibly screaming and crying. I found out later that both her parents worked in that tower. Thankfully, they both made it out in time, but she was convinced she had just watched both her parents die on television. Those screams still haunt me. Story 29. 2 moments. The moment we understood what those plane crashes truly were and the moment the towers collapsed. Story 30. The horrors of watching people jump to their deaths. Not understanding what was happening. Seeing airplanes flying overhead, making U-turns. The events of September 11th really shattered the safety bubble in the West. I was too young to comprehend what was occurring, but old enough to feel the change in the air. Story 31. The moment I understood it was not like the bombing that happened in 1993. Watching the footage, I also remember feeling panic about the flight that later crashed in Pennsylvania. It seemed completely unreal, yet there was a knowing that nothing would ever be the same again. Story 32. I was about 12, so I didn't absorb much of it. However, something that stuck with me was how clear it was that Tom Brokaw and the other anchors were uncertain about what was happening. I had never heard them speak with such a tone of genuine uncertainty before. The most trusted names in news were reduced to speculating live on air. Story 33. I remember heading to work on a beautiful day with clear skies and warm weather. When the first plane hit, there was lots of chatter. It seemed surreal. After that, all traffic stopped, and everyone gathered in front of a television. In the afternoon, panic set in as people became frantic, waiting for hours to buy gas, food, and supplies. In my opinion, the events of September 11th profoundly affected America. After that day, greed took hold. Food prices, gas prices, and car insurance costs skyrocketed overnight. Employers who used to cover 100% of healthcare costs changed their policies. Felt like the billionaires took control. Story 34. I had friends on both United flights. I was a crew member scheduled to fly to Auckland that day. I still have a hard time every year watching television coverage. Story 35. That morning was a beautiful warm fall day with golden sunshine. It felt like nothing bad should be happening on such a lovely day. Story 36. Watching the towers fall. Of all the horrors of the day, knowing that people were still in them and seeing them crumble into dust was traumatizing. Story 37. I stood on my back porch on Avenue U in Brooklyn and watched papers from the World Trade Center, half-burnt, settle in my backyard, with ash and other light debris falling from the sky. It seemed surreal. Story 38. I had made some poor choices and was incarcerated at the time. I remember being able to barely see the television the correctional officers were watching and trying to figure out what was happening. I thought about what would happen if something occurred where we were, and we couldn't get out. It was terrifying. I learned my lesson, and that was my one and only time in there. Story 39. Having to go to work is frustrating. I cannot imagine why companies across the country saw what we were experiencing and thought it was acceptable. Those high school photographs are not going to edit themselves. It's time to stop. Everyone I knew still had to go into work. After work, my boyfriend, best friend, and I went to the mall. Everything was open, but it was completely deserted. Other than employees, we were literally the only people there. Story 40. The absolute silence of the day. All traffic stopped. All planes landed. Everyone on the street disappeared. All random music was silenced. No children played. The entire world stopped, and everyone held their breath in horrified expectation. Story 41. Watching people jump out of the windows that day marked a turning point. Since then, the asinine patriotism and racism have gone off the rails. Story 42. Having to calm down my sister. I was in 6th grade and aware of what was happening. Everyone in my school spent that entire day watching the news. My sister was in 4th grade and hadn't been told anything. She came home, turned on the TV, and saw messages like, "America under attack," on several different channels. Her school let out an hour and a half before mine, so by the time I got home, she was understandably upset. I did my best, and looking back, I think I did an acceptable job. However, that isn't something an 11-year-old should ever need to do. I wasn't emotionally equipped for that, and most kids aren't. Story 43. The internet was down that day. Everyone was trying to go online to see the news, and it crashed the connection. A coworker was on the phone with a friend, getting updated news. I remember her telling me when the first tower fell, and I was absolutely shocked. It seemed like an impossible thing to happen. Story 44. The uncertainty of what would happen next was overwhelming. Remember, the Pentagon was also attacked, and Flight 93 was headed toward either the White House or the Capitol. I live on the West Coast, and the complete ground stop was incredibly eerie. I had friends in Manhattan, and it was impossible to find out how they were. Story 45. Every moment was horrific, starting with the confusion at the first strike, followed by the realization of what was happening. I watched news trucks focus on the Sears Tower, which is only an eighth of a mile from my home, and drew the blinds in the classroom because there was a clear view of the tower. I wondered about the constant beeping noise during the coverage, which turned out to be the alarms warned by firefighters lost in the rubble. I walked in my neighborhood on a perfect September day with no planes in the sky, despite being equidistant from Midway and O'Hare airports. Everyone on the street was crying. Now we have a criminal in office who is being entertained and lavished with gifts from those who murdered nearly 3,000 people, as well as slaughtering an American journalist and taking away benefits from first responders suffering from illnesses caused by debris while they tried to rescue people. Story 46. Trying to get through the phone lines to hear from family. Watching the live coverage of people making the choice to jump to certain death rather than burn inside the tower. The weeks of searching for survivors or bodies after the event were difficult. The search and rescue dogs were becoming depressed. It was traumatic and horrible, leaving lasting memories. Story 47. Seeing my mom and my aunts all sitting around the television crying when I returned to our vacation home from a bike ride on the beach. I heard someone say, "Oh my God, they are jumping." And then my aunt added, "Okay, the television is going off. The kids don't need to see this." I was only 8 at the time. I don't remember much else. Story 48. I was in the military and had just returned from a 45-day National Training Center rotation. After taking my first shower in weeks, I laid down to rest. A few minutes later, we had an emergency formation, and I was assigned to guard the parking lot of the barracks in the rain for 12 hours. I had no idea what was happening. That day marked a significant change in our operations and tempo. Everything felt different from that point on. It was a defining moment as I witnessed the shift from a peacetime military to one preparing for a long-term conflict. It was intense. Story 49. The 2 hours from when I told my wife to leave the 89th floor of the World Trade Center before the second plane hit until she finally called me from the Staten Island ferry were the worst 2 hours of my life. The second worst was when I called my dad at his office on Greenwich Street 2 blocks away and asked him to go and look for my wife before the World Trade Center 2 collapsed. It took him over an hour to call me back while he was walking over the Brooklyn Bridge. Story 50. It wasn't exactly on that day. It was 2 to 3 days later. Every time a news reporter was on the scene, there were crowds of people holding homemade missing posters as they continued to search for lost loved ones. The hope they clung to was just devastating. Shortly thereafter, seeing a plane in the sky again triggered a sick feeling in the pit of your stomach. Story 51. Hearing about the children waiting at daycare or school to be picked up by their parents who worked in the towers. Story 52. Watching the second tower get hit was a shocking experience. I was aware of the Empire State Building being struck by an airplane and hoped that the first incident was a terrible accident. I remembered laughing as a child while playing a flight simulation game and crashing into the towers while attempting to fly between them. So when I heard about the first crash on the radio, I hoped it was simply a mistake. I then turned on the television and saw the bright blue sky, questioning whether it was truly an accident. Moments later, the second tower was hit live on TV. After that, I wasn't surprised when the Pentagon was struck or when the towers collapsed. Story 53. A man is on the phone with emergency services. You hear a thunderous sound, and he starts screaming, "Oh God!" The line goes dead. The building collapses. Story 54. The second plane went from an unfortunate accident to a realization that we were at war. My father's life was saved by a canceled meeting in the South Tower 4 days before it was scheduled. The person he was flying into New York City to meet had to cancel to attend to his sick mother in the hospital. He canceled all of his meetings, saving both himself and my father's life. The rest of his office perished. What's worse? Watching Donald Trump and his supporters deny healthcare coverage for September 11th first responders by obstructing bipartisan legislation for our heroes. Story 55. Seeing the flight numbers of the planes that crashed made me realize my fiancée was on one of them. Story 56. Sitting on Metro North in an otherwise empty car, I was waiting for the train to leave Grand Central. It was around noon. Next to me sat a construction worker, gray as a ghost from the dust and debris floating in the air. He was drinking a beer from a paper bag, just staring into space. He said, "All of my friends are dead." Story 57. It was all terrible, but the moment the second plane hit and we knew this wasn't an accident made it even worse. Then the attack on the Pentagon and the towers collapsing were very frightening. Story 58. Teachers pulled out televisions to show us children what was happening. 7-year-old me didn't need to see people jumping to their death. Story 59. My mom in Queens was meant to bring my cousins to Windows on the World for a tour at the top floor restaurant in one of the towers. My dad was installing a concrete pad in a firehouse a few blocks from the World Trade Center. I was living in Ireland at the time and got up to see the second plane hit live. I couldn't reach my family for hours. Finally, I got my mom, who said she saw both hits from traffic on her way in. My dad was at the fire station when they left to head to Ground Zero. No one came back. I had lived far from home for years but never felt farther than when I couldn't reach my family on that tragic day. Story 60. I remember my coworker on the floor in a fetal position right after the news broke. Her son, husband, brother, and aunt all worked at the Trade Center. We tried our best to comfort her, but her pain was unbearable. My daughter was at work nearby that day, but she was thankfully safe. It was strange not to see or hear planes for the next few days, as we were in the flight paths of John F. Kennedy International Airport and LaGuardia Airport and were used to the constant engine noise. You could see the smoke from the fallen towers for weeks. The pictures of the missing were plastered on the walls of Penn Station. People walked around like zombies because everyone knew someone personally affected. Police officers and firefighters worked relentlessly. It was truly a horrific time. Story 61. I was 13, and it felt like there was someone out there who wanted to kill me. I remember thinking about a man named Osama bin Laden who targeted Americans. He had killed thousands of them. As an American, it meant he wanted to kill me too. It was the first time I had ever thought about things that way. We had grown up feeling like America was invincible. That myth was shattered that day, along with many others we were taught growing up, in the years and decades that followed. Story 62. We had a connection to the towers at one point and another to Reuters due to people's previous work experiences. That was challenging. On a personal level, when the plane was reported missing over Germany and en route to the United Kingdom, we thought St. Paul's Cathedral would be the likely target, but we were instructed to stay in our locations. Whitehall emptied and so did the city banks, but we were civil servants in the city. Many people left early to ensure they could get home. Story 63. I agree with what everyone says about the jumpers. There is news footage at the World Trade Center Museum in a separate room warning of the upsetting content, so you may choose not to witness it because it is difficult to watch. As a side note, get some tissues and read about Todd Beamer if you are not familiar with his story. Let's roll. Story 64. Mine is more personal and it's something I think about all the time. I was stationed in Norfolk, Virginia in the Navy. As soon as the second plane hit, the rest of the day was a blur as we got our ship ready to leave port that same night with half of our crew on leave. About an hour before we departed, one of our department officers gave a speech and told anyone who hadn't checked in with family to call home on one of the office phones. I tried calling my mom, but there was no answer. I quickly called my aunt to ask her to contact my mom and let her know I was trying to get through. My mom answered, and we had about a 2-minute conversation where I said as much as I could on a government phone. This was a woman who didn't want me to join the military after high school because the recruiter couldn't guarantee I would never be sent to a combat zone, as I was her only son. She wasn't very supportive of my joining the Navy a year after high school. I never want to hear the fear I heard in my mom's voice on that phone call from anyone again as long as I live. Story 65. Mine is very niche. I had lost my dad a couple of days before, and his funeral was that morning. The first plane hit as we were getting into the limousine to go to the funeral home. We all thought it was a freak accident. By the time we got to the funeral home, a cousin who was a federal agent had been called, and they had to come into the office. They pulled me aside to apologize for having to leave. I asked, "Oh, because of the accident?" And they said, "It's not an accident. Another plane hit the other tower, and we don't know how bad this is yet. There could be dozens of these today." I then went back in, and for the sake of my mother, pretended everything was fine outside the funeral home. We made it through the funeral home service, headed to the church for the funeral, and then to the cemetery. Normally, the ride from the church to the cemetery would only take about 20 minutes. Because everyone was heading home, it took nearly 2 hours to get through the gridlock to the cemetery. This was when I told my mom what had happened because it was unavoidable. We went through the burial and then had people back to our house, and everyone was glued to televisions, not saying a word to one another. It was the most surreal day of my life. I was struck by how kind, compassionate, and caring the funerary staff were. Even though the world was exploding around us, they remained focused on helping us through our loss. I was struck by all of our friends who remained throughout the mass, suffered through the traffic to the cemetery, and still came back to the house to be a comfort to us, even though, I'm sure, they wanted to be anywhere but there. I feel like I never truly was able to grieve my father's passing because the loss of one person became so inconsequential compared to all the thousands of lives lost that day. All the young children who would never see their parents again. My life and world had changed forever because my dad passed, but you expect it will all go back to normal day-to-day soon enough, and it will help ease the pain of the loss. But the whole world changed that day, and everything was just so sad and horrible for a long time after that for everyone. I never really healed from any of it. Those alive and old enough, it was only 24 years ago. Now my knees hurt, and I want to watch Matlock. Story 66. I didn't think about it at the time, but once that incident occurred and the media focused on the idea that the attackers were Muslim, it triggered a rapid response where some advocated for extreme measures. It happened very quickly. Howard Stern openly called for bombing campaigns within an hour or so after the second tower fell. Story 67. Besides witnessing the horror unfolding on television, I remember thinking things would never be the same again, and they haven't been. I had a class that night which I attended. My professor began by acknowledging that no one really wanted to be there. He offered anyone the chance to leave, but if we chose to stay, we could spend the time discussing what happened and how we were feeling. Most of us remained. Story 68. I watched the live coverage of the second tower being hit. I saw people jumping from the tower before they cut the footage. It gives me chills to this day. I was traumatized. I didn't realize it until later when I got a corporate office job and couldn't concentrate due to anxiety. What if I lost my life at work while at my desk, with the whole world waiting for me outside? So, I quit my corporate desk job before my career even started. I lived in my car for a long time, but I was free and enjoyed my 20s for the most part. September 11th completely changed my life in ways I cannot even begin to explain. It is baffling that people downplay this experience. Many more of us were surely traumatized, not just me. Story 69. I was suddenly targeted and called a terrorist the next day and for many years following. I was a student at the time. Later, I pursued civil engineering and focused on demolition. It was then that I realized my community and I were unjustly hated and that our countries were destroyed based on falsehoods. Story 70. I was young and didn't watch it on television because we had to be sheltered away in New York City schools. When I finally got to go home, the smoke was overwhelming. The entire sky was covered in darkness, stretching out everywhere and filling our lungs. People walked stoically, covered from head to toe in white dust and still clutching their briefcases. Soot and debris were everywhere, like a curtain covering all our windows. It took days until the rain washed it away, and I was finally able to relax my muscles and breathe. Story 71. After the first tower fell, there was a moment when all of the firefighters lost in the collapse triggered their alarms simultaneously due to lack of movement. It happened live on air, and it was one of the eeriest sounds you will ever hear. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.